would like to welcome everybody. Jana Pisani, you know currently as a faculty member in the history area, and she's also the administrator coordinator point person for our new social justice degree, the MS. So you're gonna hear the word social justice a lot tonight. And I thank Jana and Gary Huey, who's not able to be with us today, for inviting me. I used to work here at Ferris. I retired a couple of years ago, and I taught in the history area, and I taught a number of the Black history courses in the civil rights class and cultural history courses. And I did that for about 28 years while I was here, and I had a blast. And then after I retired, within about 3 months, I got very bored and I realized I don't really have any hobbies. And so as such, why not go back to school? So I enrolled in the master's program at Kendall. They have a master's degree in visual and critical theory. And I am having a blast. And it's a program that if you like information that you hear tonight, it's something to consider after you graduate, depending on whether or not you're interested in philosophy or visual studies or communication, or you want to do some social justice activism. It's something that could be yet another tool in your tool bag to use, that master's degree. And if anybody is interested, I brought some material to give you some handout literature so that you could make further inquiries. The other thing I need to let you know, again, as I get excited, I might talk faster and louder, but I also have to be considerate of you as my audience in that there are going to be a handful, about 6 images that I'm going to show you tonight that are pretty graphic, and they may make you uncomfortable or cringe. And I'm going to try to let you know when they're coming up so that if you want to avert your eyes or look down at your desktop, you can do something so that you don't have to endure that traumatic image. The slides are going to be numbers 8, 16, 17, number 19 and 20, and number 22. I'll give you an advance warning, but again, I wanted to be sure to make that clear. The other piece is that I am somebody who is a visual person. I find that I'm a visual learner, and I was a visual teacher. I use slides back with the old carousel, talk about old school technology, the old carousel projectors that would have images of the subjects and the topics, and it really helped students get it. I mean, seeing an old building from the turn of the century made understanding a tenement house or large-scale department stores or skyscrapers that much more real and tangible if students could see an image. Well, that culture has continued to evolve, and certainly the last 2 generations of people born in America, if not the world, thanks to cable television, 24/7 broadcasting, and yes, social media, that powerful engine in your pocket, in your backpack, is constantly carrying and disseminating visual messaging, visual information. Whether you are a big advocate of TikTok or you hate it, you know the power of imagery. And that kind of awareness of how we are bombarded in our society by everything, television, film, advertising, cable, social media, it is something that we need to be much, much more sophisticated, knowledgeable, wary consumers. And we need to be able to understand and pull back layers of what those images are trying to tell us, and also how they're trying to manipulate us. And we need to be cognizant of that. So in terms of the images that I'm going to be talking about, as I said, I'm going to be talking about how analog images, those are pre-digital, And they are images that were also subject to manipulation. I mean, even though now you think about photoshopping as a software that you can use for digital manipulation, back in the old days, photographers could crop. They could use a particular lens or to distort or amplify. They could position a camera in different angles so that they included or excluded information. All of these things were a factor that make us understand or need to understand that imagery can do harm as much as it can do good. And so in terms of our talk tonight, I want to show you a series of artifacts, black and white photographic images that were used for the cause of social justice. Primarily race issues is what we're going to be talking about tonight. And the idea of how photographs helped Black activists fight state-sanctioned violence. Now that's a new jargon word for present day folks in terms of your understanding maybe about Black Lives Matter. But for many, many people, whole last 20th century, when you think about Black violence or violence done to Blacks, it often came at the hands not just of everyday citizens, but the sheriffs, the local constables, the officers of the courts, and then nothing was done, which meant then that the judicial system, the court system failed these people, and then yes, the federal government. So layer upon layer of different entities that all represent the state were duplicitous and play a role in the violence that was done. So in terms of the slides I'm going to show you, I am going to be using, I'm going to throw a little 50-cent word at you, visual rhetoric. And I'm going to be using some of the not hardcore jargon associated with visual rhetoric, but that's one of the approaches that I'm learning in the master's program. And it's just a skill set of how you look at images and the questions that you raise and how you understand the workings of imagery to tell a message and how that image is using emotions to try to persuade you or craft or support an argument or a position. And then once we know that that's what images do as well as verbal debates, then we also need to think about, well, who's using that image, who's creating that image, and who's the target audience? Who is the intentional viewer that is supposed to be persuaded by those images? Now, if you just see if I can go to the next image. I just want to give credit and a little shout out to the woman who really started it in terms of fighting, raging against the machine of state-sanctioned violence, and that is B Wells Barnett. And she was one of the very first people to put pen to paper and write about lynchings. And what she primarily did was go through details that were being written and published in everyday local papers, and she just collected and compiled them. It's like a modern day database almost. And what she was able to do in her various pamphlets that didn't have any illustration, no photographic images, just words. So just like the Bible, in the beginning was the Word, and her language and that she used to both describe what the papers were saying and retell the story were horrific. That's why one of the titles is The Southern Horrors. It's about racial objection, how there's just a barbaric behavior that's happening. Red Record is alluding to the bloodlust, the bloodthirst within the lynching experience. And then here, certainly singling out what happened in one state, one locale. But Ida B. Wells was not the last. She only started the movement. She also was one of the people who was the anchor committee of 100 that started the NAACP when it began in 1909, 1910. And then peer with her group, let's see if I can, maybe you have to touch something. Maybe I didn't touch something. There we go. So we're now going to move into a little bit more, jumping ahead, maybe about 2 decades, to looking at actual photographs and how photographs then start to ripple into being used very strategically by Black activists to combat racial violence or state-sanctioned violence. And the story that we're going to be looking at is the murder of Jesse Washington. He was only 17 years old. He was accused of the crime of murder, but there were no witnesses. And it just so happened that the person he was accused of murdering was a white woman whose family farm he had just been working on. He owned a mule. The family were sharecroppers, white sharecroppers. They had no financial ability to own a mule who could do the backbreaking labor of tilling the fields. So they rented the mule from Jesse Washington, and Jesse Washington came along to run the mule. So he is also someone who was described as having perhaps mental incompetence issues, that he had a childlike understanding. So there were two things, that youth and age really kind of put him in a bad situation. Now, this event happens in Waco, Texas, and it happened in 1916. And it is still, by many accounts, considered to be one of the worst lynching efforts ever to happen. And the Crisis magazine was a relatively new publication edited by W.E.B. Du Bois. He was a contemporary of B Wells Barnett, and he managed the Crisis magazine until 1934, when he retired out of frustration with the lack of racial justice in America. The Waco Horror was part of a special supplement magazine. It was only 9 pages long, but it included probably more photographic images than any other publication that appeared in the Crisis up to that point, and I think after that point. And the images were not, graduation photographs of people, which were the norm of some of the issues in Crisis, or snapshots, head and shoulder shots of people who had done something noteworthy and notable. These were more photographs that showed a scene, a building, a setting. And interestingly enough, Baylor University, you guys probably know it, if not through sports, you've heard of them. They are a Christian Baptist-based school. They are the anchor school in Waco, and they also are the university that Waco grew up around. So it's like a symbiotic relationship. There would be no Waco without Baylor. Baylor could have existed anywhere. So here it's interesting that Du Bois, who co-wrote this article, is incorporating and showing his first picture, this anchor image, and it's a pretty large scale image when you consider that the pages were about 8 by 10 in these early issues. So it's a large scale image, and it's trying to suggest this idea about Waco is a town of education. It's a town of Christian values. It's a town that is modern and growing up. And I'm going to have a hard time with this clicker. But the article also tried to stress all the other good things that were happening in Waco. There was a brand new multi-story hotel that was, trying to attract conventions. There was a brand new courthouse. There was one of 20-something Baptist churches in town, and this one was the latest and the biggest and the brightest. It was like a, palatial granite structure that just was magnificent and generated awe. 2,000 people could sit in the arena. And this was before there was large-scale churches. So pretty impressive. Now, on the text, if you were to read the text, though, you would see that Du Bois is kind of teasing at whether or not everything is as rosy as it looks. Do these pictures really tell us the real story about Waco? And there is some discussion about segregation and economic inequality. So there are things that it's like he's juxtaposing illusion, fact, illusion, fact. This is not the fact, even though it's a photograph. Photographs are not always realistic documentations of truth. You guys know that, though. About a page or two into the article, Du Bois will incorporate a large image that is showing and documenting, sorry, the voice is getting a little loud there. He incorporates another large-scale image, and this is the crowd waiting outside City Hall where a real quick, fast trial is going on for young Jesse Washington. It lasts, I think, a grand total of 20 minutes. There was a 5-minute discussion about what was the verdict or the sentencing. It was a death penalty sentence, but the crowd was not satisfied. That was not good enough. A legal death penalty sentence was not good enough. The crowd is going to storm City Hall and grab Jesse Washington. And at the same locale where this gorgeous, I think it was an oak tree or a sycamore tree stood, that's where the lynching is going to happen. Right there where the mayor could stand and did stand in the window here and watch everything that happened. And the officers who were supposedly guarding him watched everything happen. Nobody tried to intervene. And that's why Du Bois would call this the Waco horror. This is barbaric. This is inhumane. And in the article, Du Bois uses very brief, tight header captions. He spaces it out, generally using a 2-column format. This is the next large-scale photo in the group. And now he's just calling it not the waiting crowd, but the mob. Something within a short burst of time, the action of the participants, and this, I apologize, is one of those trigger images, is happening. And if you looked real close, dead center, you see what has begun to happen. You will see that Jesse Washington is on a pile of wood that's been stolen and scavenged from buildings, neighborhood businesses, and he's being literally whipped, knifed, and once enough wood has been gathered, he will be set on fire. And he literally will be burned alive. And then eventually, the person who gathered a chain link to lynch him because they knew that the rope would burn from the fire and would not secure him. So the horror of this action is being addressed in the visuals, but now that we're deeper into the article, the verbal accounts, the interviews with the participants and the town's leaders are all documented here. And a lot of people were saying, well, this just happened. What's the big deal? The worst thing that happened was that we lost that beautiful sycamore tree. They killed the tree. That was where the injustice was felt by many of the white townspeople. So now what you're seeing is the effort with the messaging in this one article is to try to expose how mob action is tantamount to white supremacy, and that the people who are involved here are participants because you have to show in white Southern towns that you support this, you believe this, you accept this, because if you don't get recognized as an advocate of white supremacy, and as such you get denied white privilege. And remember that in Southern towns during this early Jim Crow years, white privilege meant everything, irregardless of your economic, social background, whether you were a 2-bit dirt farmer or one of the wealthiest men in town. White privilege meant that you accepted this kind of action. And it meant that you had to be part of the tribe. You had to engage in barbaric heritage. And your rage was the fact that a mentally compromised 17-year-old Black child could own a mule and you couldn't. That's the root of them. There was no pretense of a rape here, no sexual assault. It really goes down more often than not about economic disparity. And if Blacks are seen as having achieved economic wealth, then they are a threat to white identity, white privilege, and certainly it means white supremacy ain't working. Now, in terms of my next image, again, this is one of the trigger images. We see here more graphically displayed the actual lynching torture. Now, Du Bois didn't do this to attack or insult, terrorize the Black readers and white progressives who were members of the NAACP. This was done to show what was the true barbarity of a lynching. And a lynching wasn't just a quick snapping of the neck like old school Westerns when somebody's a cattle rustler. It was much more group participation. It involved physical torture like a knife. It involved, yes, oftentimes more and more burnings. And then afterwards, the body was literally dragged through town and parts of the charred pieces of his body fell off and people ran into the street and stabbed pieces for mementos to have as their collectible of having been there and been part of it. So these are the horrors of what was state-sanctioned violence. Nothing ever came of the people who were involved in this lynching. They were all known, and some of them are even smiling for the camera. They didn't have any sense of shame of being there and or worrying about the recrimination of having been captured on film, being one of the people doing this. And many of them were at the courthouse. That's why they're wearing, many of them, their Sunday best outfits, because they were probably waiting near City Hall. All of this, again, is showing the kind of larger recrimination that's happening in Waco, Texas, and the notion of the fact that horror and white supremacy were hand in hand with state-sanctioned violence. And yes, these are very old school images. A number of the pictures that Du Bois used were taken by a local photographer who would then later sell his works as postcards, because that became part of the photographic dissemination of lynching, was the purchase of postcards. And, not sure what happened there. Sorry for those of you listening. So in terms of the imagery, these are real hard to digest. They're difficult. They were intended to be difficult not for Black readers, but to make white readers more educated and in hopes of making people understand. From research that's been done about the NAACP, especially in the early 1930s, many of the staff people who worked with Du Bois felt a sense of shame when they saw images like this and heard about lynchings, because not that they were ashamed that it happened, but that they were ashamed because it showed how vulnerable they were, that they were not in a position to protect themselves. And as such, that showed a level of vulnerability to the state, and that made them very, very uncomfortable. And the word shame was used by a particular woman who was interviewed, who worked with Du Bois in the crisis office. So I think that in terms of these images, they all show you how bad it was. My next set of images are a little less graphic and or perhaps upsetting. but they show you a way in which visual rhetoric and photography is going to be used in different strategies to try to continue to bring information and awareness to this idea about state-sanctioned violence or lynchings. Now, we're looking at 1934. This is in Washington, D.C., and it's just outside the Justice Department building. And when you look at these particular individuals, I'm going to ask you, who are these people? What do they look like to you when you're just staring at this row of individuals? What, anything come to mind? Who are these people? Okay, do they look like students? Do they look like you guys? They look older. Okay. And what's different between these guys and you guys, other than don't tell me that you're white and they're black? That's too obvious. They're very well dressed. What does that say or tell you? They're educated, but aren't you educated? For back then, yeah. Does anybody know what was going on in 1934? The Great Depression. This is like 3-4 years after the stock market crashed. When you see this and you see how these people are dressed, how do you reckon white viewers would have looked at this image? How would they have reacted and responded to seeing a real snappy line of well-dressed, very mature looking African Americans? What do you reckon? What do you reckon? That idea about, hey, these people should be at the rock bottom. They shouldn't be, well dressed. I know it's November, but still. These folks should be wearing tattered stuff. I mean, when I think about blacks, I think about sharecroppers and people who look like they just got liberated from slavery. Isn't that what all Black Americans look like? Raggedy, tattery. Wouldn't that have been how many whites would have thought? Blacks, I mean, they would have had a stereotypical imagery of that black should look one way. And this was not part of that image. What else is happening in these photographs that seems to be a little off? Beyond simply, they look more mature, they're very well dressed. We know it's winter because they're wearing heavy coats. But what else? What else is there? What else do you see? They're surrounding something. Well, this is a bench, and this would have been like the yard area before, and back here somewhere would have been the Justice Department building. This is a lamp, from a street lamp. So this is a sidewalk. We see maybe a couple who were part of this group walking towards the photographer. But there's one other thing that's there that may be seen as a little off. They've got ropes around their necks and some name tags or something on them. And from out any real education beyond just what you're seeing, what we're talking about, what do those ropes symbolize? Lynching. So that, again, when we talk about visual rhetoric, we talk about these ideas that there are certain things that are visual signs and symbols that speak volumes, even though it's something very simple, like a rope, a hemp rope with a very simple knot. It's not even a real traditional noose ring of 13 wraps to make sure that the rope is taut enough to snap the neck. Now, this piece here illustrates little bit better what we were talking about. Of course, she seems to be wearing a couple of different ropes around her. But yes, they were doing this very symbolically. And the other piece that you would not have known from the photograph is that this was a march, a rally, a line being held in silence. The NAACP had done a silent protest against lynching back in 2010, 2015, and they did it up and down New York, I think Fifth Avenue. And it was a very, very somber spectacle of seeing Black men wearing mourning coats, the official formal attire of a traditional funeral. And they bore a coffin that supposedly was the body of Jim Crow. And they were walking down the avenue. No words were spoken, no music was performed, just this ominous silence. I don't think that this group was big enough to create that kind of setting or ambiance, but they still were trying to do something that was pretty respectable. What they were trying to do was get the Justice Department that was updating federal codes for different kinds of crimes. They were lobbying and petitioning and picketing to have the federal government list lynching as a federal act of murder. And they hoped that by doing that, there would be better consistency across the United States for tackling the crime, but also better record keeping. And that's one of the big problems with lynching, even to this day. There is no consistent records that were kept from one county to one state to one part of the country. We still don't really have a full tally of how many people may have been victims of lynching. So these folks are really trying to do something. If you were a part of a newspaper outlet in the 1930s, would you have taken a picture? Would you have sent out a photographer to snap some pics of these African-American protesters? Are they worthy of your newspaper's attention?
It would probably anger white readers.
Okay, so if you're a white press, you're not going to do it. You're just going to ignore it. And that's about what happened. White press did not cover this. What about if you're in the Black press? How are you going to do it? How are you going to tackle it? It could be seen as encouraging. So are you going to write articles? Are you going to take lots of pictures? What are you going to do? You're going to take pictures at least. Well, I would have liked to have thought that. I was hoping to find pictures. This is a picture that was part of the NAACP's piece, and I'm just want to show you this because I wanted you to see what was on the placard, the paper. This was consistently worn by everyone, male and female, and it said 84 women in 48 years. And it was just trying to make people aware that lynching was not a crime that only Black men experienced. Black women and yes, children were also lynched. So these young women, also Howard University students, are all part of that cadre of protesters. But in terms of the issue about coverage, newspaper coverage, there really wasn't a lot. In the Black press, I found snippets that say lynching is a crime, and then 100 NAACP protesters. And this was at one location. Here, this was the student chapter at Howard University of NAACP and another organization. I'm sorry, I kind of blanked out on what that other group was called, but they were also participants. But again, we see reference back to the language that Ida B. Wells started us out with, the idea of horror, barbarism, inhumane, uncivilized. This is what lynching should be seen as. And interestingly enough, this particular clipping was recently posted on somebody's Facebook page. She was there. She wanted people to see about it, know about it today. She was very proud of what she did 70 years ago. So in terms of the kinds of imagery, and guess what? If you look carefully at this woman, what she's holding, this is her. She's on the line. And she also was this woman. She's wearing the same style coat, where, crooked arm publication. It's the same woman. I want to identify who she is. So I got to find somebody who's going to let me in on the Facebook page so I can track down that photo share, because I think she's got a story to tell. But this is where my current passion about analyzing photography mixes up with my historical passion. And I would like to know more of the story. In terms of the ideas here, the Black press was somewhat limited, or let's say controlled a little bit in the publication. And the best image that I could find of a little bit more coverage was in the Chicago Defender. And this shows you a full page. And here we see this is now blown up here. And one of the posters is saying basically America needs a federal anti-lynching law. And this is that first photograph that I shared with you. Here, what you do see is in context, African Americans were dealing with a lot in 1934. Not only are they beginning to deal with the ideas about other crises of Jim Crow discrimination, the other big thing that had just started happening, was taking place nationally, were the Scottsboro boys trials that became the trial of the century and would span the entire decade. Now, in terms of the more, let's say, modern trend that happens with photography is going to be with a 1937 protest, or excuse me, not protest, but a discussion that involved some images that were shown in Congress while Congress was debating the passage of a federal anti-lynching legislation. Now, federal anti-lynching legislation had been talked about since the early 1920s. It never really got traction in Congress. But in 37 April, in the spring, the House of Representatives unanimously passed, not unanimously, that's overwhelming majority, passed the anti-legislation bill. Then it got passed over to the Senate. And I don't know how much you guys know about the Senate in the 1930s, but that's when filibusters were truly a thing of beauty or horror, depending on your political persuasion. And it was very much under the control of Democratic Southern senators. And there was a lot of, let's say, horse dealing, but there never were enough Southern senators who were willing to pass the legislation. Now, one of the documents, evidence that was brought into the Senate was this very simple poster display. And it is quite provocative. And in this poster, the text is really paramount. The text is telling you everything you need to know. These blowtorch lynchings occurred while the Wagner Van Nuys anti-lynching bill was pending before Congress. There have been no arrests, no indictments, no convictions of any one of the lynchers. This was not a case of rape. And again, that is a disclaimer that many victims of lynching, their families have to constantly go back and over again. This is not a case where rape was involved. It actually was, like we were discussing earlier, more about economics. These guys, this is Robert Bootjack McDaniels, and this is Roosevelt Towns. Both of these images are pretty horrific. All you can really kind of barely read is that Acme newspapers were given credit for taking the image. There is no photographer accredited to this. And then here's a little bit of text blurb that is very, very difficult, if not impossible to read. I've tried. However, from what I know, and I can tell you, this is a story about moonshine. And these were two young men who were running a moonshine operation that was competing with white moonshiners. And I guess their batch of stuff was selling better than the white guys. So there became an economic kerfuffle that ultimately ended up in, yes, these guys being chained to 2 trees and quite literally tortured with a blowtorch to extract information about where was the still, where was it located. Now, they were accused of murdering a general store owner that was a couple of miles away. Neither one of them were involved in that murder, but it was a convenient case to accuse them of. And initially, it was only Roosevelt Towns here who was accused, and then his good friend Bootjack McDaniels showed up to try to help bail him out of court. And he then suddenly got accused of murder. And another friend, a third young man, also ended up getting looped into the allegation of murder. These 2 young men were only 26 years old. They were not in any way involved with crime other than, like everybody else in the South, making moonshine was quite popular activity. And if you like NASCAR, you understand the history and origins of moonshine running. Now, in terms of the images, these images are admittedly very graphic. And what I want to ask you is that, do you think that these images put together by whatever organization or group, let's just say maybe it was the NAACP, was this an effective tool to use, for them to use, if they wanted to reach and connect with senators while they were debating passage of an anti-lynching law? Do you think these images would have been effective? In essence, did they make a strong enough emotional appeal? Are they persuasive? These are all the things that good rhetorical speeches do. They try to, create empathy and pathos. They try to do all these things. Do these images, does this poster achieve those thresholds? No? You sure you aren't reincarnated Southern senators from the 1930s? You're tough. You're tough. I would argue that it was effective. However, as you guys are clearly channeling, audience would not have been receptive. Audience would have said, seen one lynching image, I've seen another. Who's to say this isn't some kind of playtime reenactment, some game, some people are theatrically trying to show something that never happens. This kind of stuff doesn't happen in the South, certainly not in the great state of Mississippi or the town of Duck Hill, Mississippi, which is where the incident took place. Now, this image was shown in Congress, and when it was brought out, several Southern senators left the Congress floor. They just threw their hands up and said, no, I'll wait until all that garbage is out of the room. Nice way to finish up a civic debate about the merits of a federal lynching law. Now, this particular poster image was reproduced and shown in the Miami News. It's a Black-owned press in Miami, Florida. And as you can see, they have taken the whole poster image, again, that's much more reliant on text. These graphic, very gut-churning images are really masked by the poor printing quality of the newspaper and getting shrunk down into a very small size. They would not be as immediately repugnant to a Black reader, but one that would show this is the debate. And these are our examples. This is our evidence for how we could fight for something better. And yet, perhaps the best example is an editorial that appeared in the Pittsburgh Courier. Again, all in mid-late April. And this editor first describes and talks about the event, what had happened in Duck Hill, and the actions of the local politicians and political leaders, and then how that's translating into nothing happening in the Senate. But what I thought was quite fascinating is what the editorial said at the end. And I blew it up so that everybody could read it. It just basically says, and I think this is important for all of us in terms of all of our level of activism, but they use, and again, this is a word that would have been appropriate and timely in the mid-30s, the word Negro, that would not have been seen as disparaging. The average Negro on the street who wants a federal anti-lynching law can do 4 things to help. You can send money. You can send money to the NAACP to help them finance the different costs of fighting this battle and paying for the lobbying efforts. What's the next thing you can do? You can write your senators, both of them. And it doesn't matter if you live in the North or the South, write them. Next, it says, talk to your white friends. Tell them how much you care about this, how much this is important and worthy. Get them to help. And then it actually says, in a Gallup poll, even in the South, 2/3 of white people support a federal anti-lynching law. Well, drop my jaw. I mean, who would have thought? Here, again, another thing for you to do as a citizen, write short letters to the editors of your local papers. Tell them how much you care about this issue. And then it says that if every Negro who wants a federal anti-lynching law will do these 4 things, these 4 simple acts, do them now and keep on doing them until the damn law is passed. In essence, you must be persistent, you must be vigilant, and you must engage in civic involvement. You must contact your elected officials. You've got to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. You can't just sit back and do nothing, because that is when you should start feeling shame, because you did nothing. Time magazine, that same week, all of this stuff is happening. The Black press is on top of this. And now even the national media, Time magazine, one of the big weekly publications in the United States at the time, incorporated this photograph in their national affairs section, and they basically cover pro and con. This is the debates. trying to be neutral, and yet they selected the lesser provocative, grotesque image of the two. They named the two people, and then they wrote 17 Southern representatives voted for the anti-lynching bill. Is that image, is that text, is that little pronouncement, is that saying that Time magazine supports the anti-lynching measure or not? You're saying no. What leads you to that conclusion? Again, they're showing you a graphic image of a lynching. So it's still happening, it's still going on. Anybody? They're not really calling people out who said no, who turned this down, and who, while they're debating and talking and having all this kind of ideological, political debate, people are dying. There's consequences to political inaction. And that is what these images certainly keep telling us. And now we're getting close to the end. This particular image is the second, it's the other blowtorch lynching image. It's the other, this is Robert McDaniels, nicknamed Bootjack. When you see this image, and it was published by Life magazine in 1955, Life magazine was the standard bearer of documentary photography in the 1930s. If you wanted to know about the Dust Bowl, if you wanted to know about what it was like for people in the Civilian Conservation Corps, if you wanted to know what it was like to deal with avalanches in Colorado, you found out about it, you saw it, you experienced through these very, very narrative-oriented, people-oriented stories that appeared in Time magazine. But what's interesting is that this photograph wasn't published in the 1930s. Life magazine didn't cover it. They didn't include the other image, even though both were taken in 1937. This image was reprinted without a caption, without any kind of photo identification of who or what or where or when in 1955. Why the heck would they pull out an old lynching, torture, murder scene from 1937 to appear in a 1955 issue? And I'm still trying to track down what month it was. So I apologize that I can't tell you at the moment. I'm still trying to find a bound periodical. Anybody know what was happening in 55? 1955. Oh my goodness. Stuff about civil rights. Anybody can remember anything specific? A little bit like older, like at the very beginning, the catalyst. Before there was an MLK, there was a seamstress who tried to keep her seat. Rosa Parks happened. That was in December of 1955. Does anybody remember a legal ruling that said that separate but unequal, separate but equal is unequal? That ruling came down in 54 through 55. Brown 2, the actual implementation happened in 55. But there's one other thing that happened in 1955 that probably was a nod or a tip of the hat, if I want to give Life magazine credit for being liberal and being progressive. And it was something that also happened in Mississippi. And it also involved a mom making a very, very painful decision about having an open casket. Emmett Till was kidnapped, tortured, and murdered. And I don't think Duck Hill is that far from Oxford. They both happened in Mississippi, and guess what? Nobody in either case was ever captured, arrested, charged, tried, convicted. In either case, they're still trying to get justice for Emmett Till. These guys, they didn't have a Mamie Bradley fighting on their cause. So in terms of the idea about visual imagery, photographs, they can be persuasive, they can be powerful, and they can serve as a catalyst for a revolution. And many people do give credit, a nod, to the photographs that Amy Till allowed to have taken of her son's open casket in Jet magazine as an important movement for civil rights awareness and activism. The reason I wanted to show you that last picture, and this is the last kind of segue on how images morph and can have a second life, a third life. In the 1980s, a handful of Black women artists became very, very well-known, celebrated, particularly Lorna Simpson and Carrie Mae Weems, for being involved in what was called identity politics. A lot of their artwork dealt with race and gender and intersectionality of both of those issues and how it complicates things. These two women also came from the same art school in San Diego, California, and they did a lot with mixing text and photography, and they dealt with racial stereotypes and a lot of things that are incredibly important. And yet, Pat Ward Williams was a little older than they, born in 1960, born in 1953. Pat Ward Williams was born in 1948. She came from Florida, and she went to a couple of different East Coast art schools. And yet, her work really got eclipsed and overlooked by the celebrity status that these other two artists garnered. And yet, for our purposes, for our conversation today, Pat Ward Williams was going through a garage sale or an antique store, and she happened upon a Life magazine that had that photograph of Boot Jack McDaniels. Again, no text, no credit, no accompanying story. And she was outraged. She was angry, hostile. Why? How is this? And so she internalized and then projected her anger and frustration into what we would call an assemblage art. She made this wooden frame or adapted it. It's actually a window. Here's the full shot of the image that was in the magazine. Then she blew it up, and she used these kind of sectional blow-up pieces to be in these other three frames for, really focusing on the means of abduction or securing and keeping him immobile. And Pat Ward Williams also used kind of black chalkboard material to write an accusatory text around the image. And so that you can better appreciate that text, I wrote it and transcribed it a little bit here for you so you can follow the narrative better. But I think it's really important. She wrote, there's something going on here. I don't understand it right away. I just saw that he looked so helpless. He didn't look tortured. He didn't look lynched. What is that? How long has he been locked to that tree? Can you be Black and look at this without fear? Life magazine published this photo. Could Hitler show pictures of the Holocaust to keep Jews in line? Who took this picture? Couldn't he just as easily let that man go? Did he take his camera home and bring back a blowtorch? And where do you torture someone with a blowtorch? Burn off an ear, melt an eye, a screaming mouth? How can this photograph exist? Oh God, who took this photograph? Who took this picture? How can this picture exist? Somebody do something. Now that artist is putting a very heavy load at the feet of her viewer, the spectator. Are you going to be duplicitous and complicit in just being an observer of the torture, the crime? Or are you going to follow the advice of that earlier editorial and do those 4 things? You're going to get involved, you're going to write letters, you're going to protest, you're going to do something to try to make it a little bit of a better place. And when you think about the fact that this appeared and in August 55, Emmett Till happened, the question is, because certainly this artist didn't make any attempt to find out the history of when that image was published, could there have been a positive meaning behind the publisher's intent? No, she took it that this is another re-victimization of a Black victim. One more round of exploiting the violence. Now, in terms of the kinds of ideas or things to bear in mind is that certainly Williams was a conceptual artist. She does want to provoke you. She does want you to think about what you see and think about what you feel. And she wants you to do something. And hopefully you do something like get involved in a local cause or local change or local activism that, yes, advances stopping state-sanctioned violence. And more often than not, state-sanctioned violence happens against racial minorities and ethnic minorities. And that means, yeah, you and I as white folks, we got to be part of the solution and not just part of the problem. We've got to get involved. We've got to be engaged. And so I just would say for those of you who are interested in social justice, you do stand on the shoulders of giants. There have been incredible people, men and women, who came before you, who came before me, and who did amazing stuff. But that battle, that war is not over. And you got to climb up on board and do something. You've got to get involved, even if it's only doing those 4 simple things that our editorial suggested that we do. The more you get involved, the more you can change your society and make it a better reflection of a place that you want to live and be. And I would close with that little sermonette. I thank you all, and I will appreciate any questions that you may have. I might have gone too fast over something, so if you do have any questions, I'm all for it. I'd love to tackle it.
That would go for chat as well?
Yes, yes, chats are welcome as well. Oh man, I hope I didn't bore the pants off of anybody. So are you guys here as extra credit for a class? Christian Peterson's class? 3. Wow, a trifecta of extra credit points. I will not mention your name. Don't want anybody to rob you of your extra credit points. Oh,
Okay, Christian has a question.
Okay.
For everyone. Do you think high school students are mature enough to discuss the subject of lynching?
oh, that's a good question. What do you guys think? High schoolers? Think about, yeah, I've got a couple people, one person shaking their head, yes, and another person saying, Can I get your reasonings? Why not? Why is it maybe not a good idea?
They're not mature.
They're not mature.
They might go like kind of like over their head a little bit. They might not have like education on it.
Okay, might go over their head. You said immature, you think like they might snicker or,
Maybe depends. I mean, definitely not. I would say at most seniors.
well, you would only tackle it with the senior crowd, okay? And you said yes,
I think the only way for them to become educated on it is for them to become educated on it.
okay? So again, a rude awakening to, if nothing else, to shock them into an awareness that this has happened, and sadly, this is continuing to happen. You as young people get to stop and get involved with some state sanctioned violence because you pull out this puppy. And a young girl that was willing to record 9 minutes of a police officer's knee on a man's neck served to get a conviction when few thought that was ever going to be possible. So things can happen. This is digital, but Christian, I'm sorry, I kind of steered the question away from the high schooler, but I think that it's a little bit, it's a 2 say no, 1 says yes. Any other questions? Oh, some of the discussants are also saying something. No, Rosie said something about that was chiming in.
Oh, do you want to read that?
Well, Rosie says, I'd say, and I don't know if that should be no, but my school did discuss lynching, but not to the extent as this discussion did. And I agree that high schoolers should learn of lynching to become more educated. So we got 2 and 2.
We have another question from Christian.
Okay.
Did any aspect of your research really surprise you or shock you? Or did it confirm what you expected?
I was shocked to discover the 1934 protest images, and I was elated to discover the activism that was going on. And I had not heard much about or anything about that particular protest. And in the Library of Congress, there are 14 photographs that were taken by the NAACP, but without record or attributing any information about who the photographer was. But that was really amazing. And then I knew about Pat Ward Williams' protest artwork, but I never knew the full history of the image that she was engaging with. And I'm going to be doing some more deep diving on that, but I feel kind of uncomfortable in saying, I don't think she did research on that image. I think she dealt with her immediate visceral response to the image in the context in which she found it, unattributed in a 1955 magazine. And I think that for me as a historian and as a visual studies scholar, I want to know the context, and I want to dive deeper to understand the origin and the evolution of the image in all of its manifestations. Hope that answered your question, Christian.
Said yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
I ask you, so for students who might be interested in this topic to research further, are there particular historians or,
Oh,
or things that you would recommend?
right, yeah, there are a number of publications that have been coming out since 2000 with the exhibition of James Allen's photography, postcard collection. There have been a number of debates on the pros and cons of lynching imagery and how it should be seen or viewed. One of the best people, I think, who's written about it is a scholar named Sean Michelle Smith. She teaches at the Visual Studies program at Chicago. She's written two books on it. It's, she's just an incredible scholar. Dora Appel, who teaches down at Wayne State, has written a very, very small little book about it, talking also about the ethics of lynching. And then there's another, again, woman scholar. Her name is Amy Louise Wood, who has written very powerfully about this. And she's taking the angle about the spectators. So her focus is not on the lynching victims, but what it means for white people to be involved and to participate. And so some of those ideas that I was sharing about white privilege and how whites benefit by participating in lynchings comes from her work. But if anybody is interested, just email me, and I've got a bibliography list I'm happy to share with anybody who's interested in it. But it's also depressing. I won't, it's hard and it's difficult. So you really want to take it in bite-sized chunks. It's, but it is worth learning about and understanding and trying to then figure out how can we use that legacy of violence to help fix the present.